I'm Judy Sarian, and I'm on the board of the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research. On behalf of NASR, International Armenian Literary Alliance, and the Krikor and Clara Zorab Information Center, we are co-sponsoring the Literary Lights series. Yalla, the International Armenian Literary Alliance, is a community of Armenian writers and their champions, and it supports writers by developing and promoting Armenian literature in the English language. This afternoon, we will present the second book in our 2024 Literary Lights series, Ariel Djanikian's The Prospectors. All of the books in Literary Lights are available at the NASR bookstore, online or in person in Belmont, Massachusetts, and through yallasbookshop.org. Today, Aline Ohanesian will interview Ariel Djanikian, and Aline is the author of the critically acclaimed novel Orhan's Inheritance, which was longlisted for the Flaherty-Denham First Novel Prize, a summer 2015 Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers pick, an April 2014 Indie Next pick, and an Amazon Top 25 pick for 2015. The novel was also a finalist for the PEN Bellwether for Socially Engaged Fiction and has been translated into 13 languages. Ohanesian lives and writes in San Juan Capistrano, California, with her husband and 2 young sons. I will now pass the baton over to Aline Ohanesian, who will interview Ariel Djanikian. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Judith, for that lovely introduction. It is my pleasure to be here with all of you. I'd like to introduce you to today's author. Ariel Djanikian grew up in Philadelphia. She attended the University of Pennsylvania and went on to receive an MFA in fiction from the University of Michigan. Her first book, The Office of Mercy, was published with Viking Penguin in 2013. Ariel's short stories have appeared in Tin House, Alaska Quarterly Review, Glimmer Train, and elsewhere, and have been recognized twice as notable publications by Best American Short Stories Anthology. She has also written essays and book reviews for The Millions, The Rumpus, and the very prestigious Paris Review. She began working on her novel, The Prospectors, 18 years ago when she traveled to the Yukon with the funding of a Fulbright grant. The Prospectors was published this past fall and was the Barnes & Noble Book Club pick for October. Ariel lives in Bethesda, Maryland with her husband, 2 children, and a golden retriever, and she teaches fiction writing at Georgetown University. Ariel Djanikian, welcome. We are so thrilled to have you. Can't wait to start this conversation.
Thank you so much, Aline. Thank you, Judy, also for getting us going here. As I've told Aline, I have been a huge fan of hers for many, many years and wanted to meet you for so long. We're on opposite coasts, but here we are together, which is amazing. And I'm thrilled to be here. So a quick thank you to Judy, to Olivia, and to Josep, and everyone involved in putting together the Literary Lights series. I'm very happy to be here as a participant today and as an audience member at other events. And thank you everyone for coming out on this Saturday. I really appreciate it. So as Aline said, I'm going to, this is The Prospectors. It came out in October. And I guess to get us going, I'll read a little from the book. I'm going to read from the prologue. So, easy if you want to follow along, if anyone wants to. Just about probably a 6-minute reading, but hopefully it gives a bit of a taste of the novel, the atmosphere. We are in the height of the Klondike Gold Rush of 1898, and a bit of an introduction to the main character of the book, Alice, who is 20 years old and has traveled to the Klondike from her family's fruit farm in Selma, California. She's up north with her sister and her brother-in-law. And without giving too much away, I'll say just at this point of the novel, this little snippet, there's been a theft of gold from the claims. They think they caught the guilty party, and that person has died, but it's not clear whether they were actually guilty or not. So, Klondike, 1898. In the narrow attic, Alice crouched under a sloping roof, one hand lightly balanced against a rough burlap bag of gold. The low voices of her sister and brother-in-law wafted below, mixed with the calls of sparrow and wren, until finally sweeping out of the house. She waited, then pushed the rope ladder so that it dropped and struck the lumber floor, and descended rung by rung from her perch. The front door had been propped open, and the whole cabin was drenched in white light. No one had slept. Probably no one had gone to bed. The bench and chairs were askew at the table. Last night's bottles stood out, as well as a scatter of small, cloudy glasses. The area under the bench was filthy, with those mud patties that the boots carried in. And of course, later it would fall to her to clean them. Her head turned slowly toward the empty view of the claim. What world was this? In the last year, it had kept changing on her. It wouldn't hold still long enough for anyone to answer the question. She drifted toward the big outside, grabbing a straw hat off the iron peg and pushing it onto her head without pausing. The workers had taken their season's pay and left the pale, flapping tents across the creek, mostly abandoned. On the bank, in fact, dangerously close to the fast-moving water, was a forgotten pan, dull tin and slightly concave, almost exactly the breadth of her hat. A toppled pile of pay dirt sat on the square of canvas next to the sluice. With a farm girl's intolerance for a half-finished job, she dug out a handful of dirt and dropped it into the pan. She scooped in creek water and, in a motion the workers had thought it a lark to teach her, twitched the pan around until the grayish water began to fly off the edge. A bright spot flashed in the cyclone, then another. She stopped her motions only once the water was gone. With a practiced precision, she touched her fingertip to the largest sliver of gold that was stuck to the base. Pure money transferred itself onto her skin, a thrill. They traveled 2,000 miles for this, into a treacherous land that was theirs and not theirs, in order to take a piece of metal and, as she was doing it now, drop it assuredly into a pocket. Her eyes shot up. Across the creek, Clarence Barry, her brother-in-law, was making his way from the workers' tents. His big round face was clenched and glum, and his thumbs were tucked into the two red lines of his favorite suspenders. Last night, he had sprung at her and bullied her into retreat. She'd never felt a hate like that, though it was also proof, she had thought, of his own mounting uncertainties. Joining him now, descending the naked hill, was her sister, Ethel, taking careful steps on the incline. Unlike her husband, Ethel was alert to Alice's presence, and her gaze caught quickly on the hunched figure at the water's edge. "Alice, come here. We want to talk to you." But the benefit of the wide land, the whooshing wind, the fast-moving creek, a sister's weak voice, she could neglect to hear what she did not want to hear. So, with sleeves sopping and heavy, and with gravel crunching under her boots, Alice left the pan on the sluice and crossed claims 3 and 4 until she'd reached the pit-marked 5. Ahead, on the bare part of ground, and before the ragtag brush, was the low, tilting shed that stored the winter tools. She stopped, then took one more tentative step toward the shed's ill-fitted door. Last night, Clarence had told her, "There's a man inside that shed." He'd meant to say, "There's a body inside that shed." A breeze rippled the water and bent the tallest weeds. They could not undo what was already done, though maybe other small cruelties, which were accruing at such a pace she could hardly make sense of them, perhaps those could be subdued. She stayed very still. Her head and neck were poised in that special way of a mind about to make a decision. I need to stop, she thought. Then, as if in a twinkling, but I don't think I can stop. She could feel in the heat of the sun the growing warmth of a lush and opulent, if otherwise hazy future. She thrust a hand into her pocket and, seeking its power, pinched the sliver of gold between finger and thumb. And I'll stop there.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much for reading that gorgeous prologue. I wanted to tell you that I inhaled this book. I couldn't put it down, yet I was so cognizant of it, of the pages ending. Like I just didn't want it to end. That's the kind of book it is. For those who haven't had the privilege of reading it yet, The Prospectors is a sweeping rags to riches story of an American family during the Klondike Gold Rush in Alaska. I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about the process of writing it. I think when I was reading your bio, I read that it took you 18 years to write this book. Tell us about that journey. That's longer than most marriages these days.
Yeah, I know, right? Well, I should say 18 years of, scattered work on and off. So this was a story. It's a historical novel. It's based on my own family history on my mother's side. So the basics of the story I knew for a long time. Alice is based on my great-great-grandmother. And she did travel to the Klondike in 1898 during the gold rush with her sister and her brother-in-law. They did strike gold and were able to hold on to that wealth for a short amount of time, and their lives were absolutely transformed. They had started as very poor, destitute fruit farmers in Selma, California. So this was an absolute change to their life. And it was part of the family legend, family lore. Again, I'll say in the context of this event, I am half Armenian. So this is not my Armenian side of the family. This is my mother's side. My father's side is Armenian and has a very, fascinating family history. So I guess family history on both sides has always been a part of my life. But this novel I knew about and I wanted to write about it even when I was pretty young. So even when I was in my early 20s and was starting out in writing. So I did travel to the Yukon and I said, I'm going to write this book. I did my research, I got my grant, and I was overwhelmed really with the information that I was gathering. And Aline, I talked a little about, the process of research. It's a lot. You have to become an expert on something, which is its own journey, even before you start the book. So I kind of knew I was out of my depth, I think, at that point. And so I had done the research and I had a lot of false starts, a lot of scenes. I put it away completely. I wrote The Office of Mercy. I came back to it and I did a full draft that was similar to this, but different. It had a different frame. Instead of the contemporary frame, it had a World War II frame. And that didn't work. So I put it away again. And then the next time I came back to it, I was able to bring it into the form that it is now. So yes, a lot of starts and stops along the way.
Well, lucky for us, you were resilient. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this incredible book. Let's talk a little bit about you mentioned the sheer volume of historical research. I want people to know that this book is a very rich and colorful tapestry of dozens of historical stories, contemporary narratives, family story, public history, private history, stories that have been erased, which our Armenian audience is very familiar with historical erasure.
Mhm.
You know, how do you decide what to include and what not to? There's the sheer scope of narratives in this novel is so impressive, Ariel. And how do you sieve through all that information? And are you thinking of the characters first, the plot first? What's your process like when you're looking at this cornucopia of
Yeah.
research?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And it's almost like this plethora of riches. There's so much out there and you want to put it all in, but of course that doesn't make for a good novel. So you do have to pick and choose. And I think it's just a process for me. I had to learn myself that the details and the historical details especially had to follow the character. Like if they weren't relevant for the character, there were so many peripheral stories that I did want to put in and I couldn't. So that would just came through in the writing. But I think it was important on the other hand to make sure that you did have that moment where you had a wide net and we're just taking everything in and just open to everything that's out there. So it was all different sources and places that information was coming from. I mean, traditional sources like, history books, even history books that no one had, I would get them out of libraries and like no one had taken out these books in decades, the history of, mining techniques in the Yukon, like no one had touched that book in many years. And
I have
then
not.
yeah, yeah, right. It was interesting. I drew a lot from letters, which were really important for trying to get the voice of people who, because the voice so much is the same. People don't change between 1898 and today in a lot of ways, but there is something to that voice, to the cadences of speaking and language. That I was able to like grab from letters and from little snippets of people's memoirs. And then also it was really important because it was left out, from some of the there are several big history books about the Klondike and about the Klondike Gold Rush, but a lot of the First Nations stories weren't part of those histories. And these were books written in the 1980s, early 1990s. And I would go to the index being like, okay, well, where is that chapter? And it didn't exist. So, Canada actually, I feel like is ahead of the United States in a lot of ways in preserving the stories of the First Nations, people who are there publicly. In Dawson City, there's the Danohajo Cultural Center, which, has its kind of echoing institution in my book. But I met with them when I first traveled to the Yukon. And they have their own amazing archive of stories and history. So it was important to me, and of course that's as an Armenian, there is that parallel, as you said, the parallel of having this violence in your history, especially, genocide, and people don't want to call it that. People want to forget about it because it doesn't fit with the national story that they want to tell. So, like Anna, the character, it was always very obvious to me, okay, this is missing from the family story. This is missing from the big history books. So I'd say it came quite naturally to me from the beginning. I always knew that was going to be part of the book.
Let's touch on that because the characters that you've mentioned, they're so fascinating. Your main character is Alice in the historical narrative, and then Anna is the contemporary character, or the main contemporary character. The story takes place sort of like with the idea of manifest destiny in the background. You never really use those words, and but you're sort of writing against the idea of the inevitability of this like Western migration and conquest. And and especially with Alice, the historical character, she starts out as this sympathetic poor farm girl, really worried about her that first chapter. She's got no love prospects, which is incredibly important at the time for a woman. She's sort of plain and overlooked, and she's sort of an old maid in a very poor farming family. And throughout the course of the novel, without any spoilers, she has this insatiable appetite that changes her and makes her, I guess I'd use the word dangerous, in a way. And it was so subtly done. I wonder if you can talk about the sort of idea of the inevitability of
Mhm.
this Western migration and the conquest versus like the personal individual characters' nuanced changes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was that her transformation was such a huge draw to me in writing the book. Um, because I did want to write about capitalism in a way and what capitalism does to you. So I think in writing Alice, again, she is in some ways like the happy rags to riches story, because she starts out so destitute as a small child. She's nearly starving, literally almost starving to death. Her parents are very poor. The farm is failing. And so she's the person you root for, right? She's the person in capitalism. Well, she got up and she did what she had to do, and she bettered her circumstances. And that's the kind of story we cheer on. But the thing is, what if she keeps going? What if she doesn't stop? And so she gets to a certain point of comfort. And this is, I mean, true back then, true, very true today. I mean, we have billionaires, right, among us right now, who never stopped. And she doesn't stop. And to me, that was the fascinating part of capitalism, that there is no stop sign. You don't get to a certain point and say, and like society tells you, oh, that's enough. And that economy you're in says, oh, that's enough. No, people keep going and going and going and going. And so that was certainly true at the time in terms of, yeah, exactly like what you said, like this insatiable appetite for more and more and more, to expand, to become bigger, to become more powerful. So Alice was compelling to me because when we think of like American capitalism, we kind of think of the businessman, right? So in 1898, we would think of Clarence Berry with his whiskey and his, gold, and eventually his oil. Like that's the kind of person, that's the face in your head when you think about capitalism. But to me, it affects everyone. Once you're in a society, once you're in an economic system, I mean, like it's all around you. You barely even notice it because it permeates every aspect of your life. So of course it permeates Alice's life, and it permeates Jane's life too. So they're both people who are using the same tools as Clarence to get ahead. It's harder for them because they're being held back by race, by class, by being a woman. But I wanted to show the kind of manipulations they do within this system also.
Yeah, let's talk about Jane and Alice. So Jane is the native indigenous character in the historical narrative, and she's described as the main character. Alice's like mortal enemy, I think were the words used in the book. But it seemed to me that these two women had they understood each other better than anyone else understood them, as much as they hated one another. There's a wonderful passage, one of my favorite ones, on page 133, where this is how Alice describes Jane. Jane had a way of well, I'll start with this. It was exhausting to be together all day. Jane had a way of telling a story, then making it twist. For instance, she would talk as if a Christian way of life was superior. And then when you least expected it, you'd find her stacking her mother's people on top. And it goes on and on about how annoying this is. And there's such a power dynamic. We talked a little bit about class and capitalism, but the racial element is really, really well done in this book. Could you talk about the idea of racism wasn't really recognized back then, but it plays such a big part in your narrative, especially when concerning the Native characters. Could you tell us about how you managed to give us a full view of Native characters without being in their point of view?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that was important to me. To give it, like you said, to give the view of Jane, but I didn't feel confident or as if I had the right to fully go into her perspective. So we always stay within Alice's perspective, but I think just in writing in general, I like work that can stay within a limited third person, but fully let the other people live and be complicated. So I did my best to do that with Jane, and I'm glad she came through for you. And I just love Jane. I love Jane. And I think of her and Alice as really almost exactly the same personality in so many ways. I mean, they go through life with their elbows out. They are not going to be the victims in any situation. And as happens in life sometimes, people who are so similar end up being enemies, and that is the context of their situation where they're pitted against each other. They're never going to get to be the Clarence Barry. They're never going to get to be the owner of the business. So they're sort of jostling and fighting for scraps, which is the tragedy of their relationship, is that they are so similar. And yet they are only allowed to be enemies because they're fighting over there isn't enough to go around for the women in Clarence's life, for the money that's there. And then it's when I think of how Alice treats Jane, I mean, in one way there's an absolute cruelty because she uses her position as a white woman, she leverages it against Jane. On the other hand, she recognizes Jane's intelligence and she sees her as an equal. And I think that's true throughout the entire book. I mean, there's an absolute awareness of how powerful Jane is as a person.
Yeah, and that really translates in every line of dialogue that Jane has in the book. She's definitely a perceivable threat throughout, even though we know she's unempowered in every imaginable way. I love, there's a passage that I love because you're dealing with characters and individuals character arcs, but you're also giving us a really good idea of what people in the last decades of the 19th century how they perceived race. There's a passage on page 256 that just made me laugh out loud and made me think, and it was just this is what my book looks like, just so you know. It's Jane again, and she says, it was a common thing now on the East Coast to fall over oneself in grief for the Indians, but it was only possible on that side of the country, and I'm paraphrasing or I'm summarizing, because the Indians there were already exiled or dead, and even then it seemed a dubious sentiment, like a person who claims to regret their own birth.
Mm-hmm.
Such a lovely passage. When you are balancing that character arc and the larger story and doing it in such a masterful way so that we understand the history and the implications without it feeling at all heavy-handed. It's completely seamlessly woven into the narrative and into the character's story arc. Was that a difficult balance when you were looking at the larger socioeconomic, geopolitical, historical narrative?
Mm-hmm.
How do you balance that for an audience who want to tackle? Because this is a really masterful piece of historical fiction. I think that's something most writers grapple with, is how do they weave the big history into the narrative?
Mm-hmm. No,
Without
thank you.
foreshadowing the characters,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I find it a difficult thing to do, which is why it took 18 years in some ways. I mean, I think it is something about um, trying to absorb that larger social and political world into your, learning as much as you can, absorbing it into you. But then when you go to write, trying to see it subjectively from the character's perspective. I mean, you never want to have that kind of like top down, I'm going to give you a lecture type of voice in a novel. At least I don't respond to that as much. So I think it is just trying to fully immerse yourself in the subjective view of whatever character you're speaking from at that moment. And I mean, because that's the best way to, I mean, the novel needs to have that really limited perspective, because it's not history. It's not just what happened. It's like, how does it feel? Like, what did it feel like if I'm this person back then? What are my thoughts? What are my emotions? What are my deep concerns? So it is, I think it's a two-part process of really feeling like you have a grasp of what the social world is like at that time, but then being able to put that away and try to see it from the smaller perspective. Um,
Yeah. Thank you for
yeah,
that.
it is. It takes time. Yeah, it took me time.
It's a tough balance. It's a tricky balance.
Yeah.
Speaking of characters, the contemporary characters, Anna and Owen, can you tell us a little bit about the decision to, I mean, they're so well-meaning and they're so sort of aware, self-aware, but even they clearly have blind spots. Could you talk a little bit about Anna and Owen, the contemporary characters who are framing this historical story, and how their
Yeah.
identity influences the way they see the past?
Yeah. Yeah. So like I said before, I had the frame was actually the last thing that came to me while I was writing the book. So it started out as a World War II narrative that just between Peter and Winnie, but it just wasn't working. And my husband, my boyfriend, he was my boyfriend at the time, but we had traveled together up to the Yukon. And when I was thinking about how am I going to make this novel new for myself and for others, and how am I going to get a new way in, I realized that that trip had been really formative for me. And I thought, well, I can, it didn't happen the way it happens in the book, of course. For me, it was a research trip. But the act of, being in the 21st century and looking back on the history was obviously something I'd been doing and I knew very well. And Aline, your book too has that frame of the historical sections and the more contemporary sections. And that to me in historical novels in general is something I always have admired, because it's become something, I mean, like a little different than just a straight historical novel that never leaves that original time frame. It makes you question as an author and as a reader, okay, well, we have this history, what do we do with it? Like where are we going to go from here? How do we deal with the things that have happened in the past, especially when it's about injustice, when it's about theft of land, when it's about theft of resources? I mean, we have to ask even 100 years later, okay, we know it happened, but what do we do about it? So Owen and Anna are, Anna, like me, is half Armenian. Owen, like my husband, is Jewish. So I was able to, if you do the math, they were younger in 2015 than we were. So they are young millennials. But I did want to use them as to try to, and I don't think they have answers in the end. They don't answer those questions. What do we do with history? But they try, because it's one thing just to acknowledge the past, but then to say like, okay, well, do we, are they going to help Grandpa Pete transfer millions of dollars to the cultural center in Dawson City? Are we going to do that? Do we put a number on the suffering that happened 100 years ago? That to me is an incredibly complicated question. I mean, it's a question that, like many organizations that I'm part of, there's like a land acknowledgement for whatever Native American group was on the land before an institution came in, for instance, in DC. So we can acknowledge what happened and where we are and acknowledge the stories of the past, but then saying, okay, what are we going to do in terms of reparations, in terms of land, money? It gets very messy and no one is really sure. I mean, honestly. So I think that was the important part of those millennial characters for me to say, okay, what do we do with it? And then to acknowledge their own, I mean, we're not perfect in the 21st century, right? So even though Clarence or the Berries or other prospectors who were going up to the north, it's easy for us to look at them and say, okay, they were face to face with First Nations people and they were taking their land and putting literal stakes into the ground and saying, this belongs to me now. So for us, it's very easy to look at that and say, okay, that was wrong. That was theft. That was treating people badly. But then you have Anna and Owen in the 21st century and all of us saying, okay, well, we, you know, we're not face to face with the people who maybe like worked in a factory and made the things that are in our house right now. Everything is very removed. Everything is kind of obscured. And it's not clear how your situation, your day-to-day life might be harming others, but that doesn't mean that harm doesn't exist. So I wanted to draw that parallel as well.
There's a great passage on page 99 exactly about them having this conversation. You know, I think it's Anna who asks Owen, do you think Clarence Berry treated his workers well? And he says, I hope so. And I think it's him who says, how often do you think about the people who suffered to make your phone? And sort of allows Anna to really look at herself and her 21st century life. And because she's having a moment of, you know, a real judgmental moment about her ancestors and how they behaved. And he's there to, I think it's Owen who says, you know, the harm you do to other people is so obfuscated by all these layers of economic transactions that it's almost totally hidden. And then she says, so we're just as bad as Clarence Berry, you know, and it's just a great conversation that people should be having as they, you know, I'm speaking to you from Tongvalan. I'm in Orange County, California, but I'm living on Indigenous land. And for us to be just aware, like that level of awareness is just the beginning. And then what to do with that awareness is so perplexing for all of us and so different per situation, you know. I think I would love to open up to some questions. If we have so many people in our audience, there's dozens and dozens of people on this phone call. If anyone has a question, we'd love to hear from you. Nancy says, I wonder about your personal journey writing this book and how or if fiction and imagination brought you to your ancestral history. Great question, Nancy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was always compelled by this story. I was always a big reader as a kid, but I don't think it was set in stone that I was going to become a novelist. I majored in chemistry when I was in college. I was very much into the sciences, but I think, you know, as for your question, Nancy, I think imagination kind of pulled me away from the sciences. I'd be in the lab and I'd be like printing out stories from my fiction workshop and I would forget about the chemistry experiment that was going on. So I think it was clear that I was sort of like destined for a different profession. But once I do hear about a compelling story or sort of like get on track of a particular history or idea, I do just want to keep following it. And where there's missing information, I just want to keep filling it in. So I think it is, I guess, innate to a certain degree what clicks for you in life. But it was for this story, especially like the Klondike, the gold rush. I just needed to be there, and I wanted to like be somewhere transportive. I mean, when you're writing a book, you spend a lot of time there. So you want to be somewhere that's going to engage your mind in interesting ways. And this I knew was going to do it for me.
Your two books are so different. The first one is a dystopian. I haven't started reading it yet, but I did order it after finishing the Prospectors. It's so impressive that you've done two completely different genres. Could you, there's someone here who asks about, I think her name is Garine or Garin. She asks about your writing process. Are you in a writing group? Do you write in the mornings? Do you wear a special hat? You know, every writer has crazy rituals that they need to do. Do you go to retreats? What does it look like? What does your process look like?
Yeah. Well, my ideal process, my ideal would be to wake up in the morning and like not have anyone talk to me, to drink my coffee and just work first thing in the morning. I'm a morning person. The reality of that does not line up usually because I have two kids. They need to get ready for school. My husband's great. Sometimes he'll just give me the morning off entirely and do it, but he has to get to work. Unfortunately, we have our golden retriever puppy needs to be walked. So I don't always get that ideal writing situation. But I just like to be alone. I can be alone for hours, and just shut the door. And I try recently, I've been trying to write every day on a new project. So, you know, sometimes there's months that go by and nothing's happening, but then when the momentum's there, I really try to keep on it by writing every single day. I have a small writing group and I don't share work until the manuscript is completely finished. But it's, yeah, I know some people are like, write a paragraph, they're like, let me show people, like, I want to get feedback right away. And there's something to be said for that, but I need to have it completely done before I give it away. And then of course there's problems with that because then you think it's done and then you give it to someone else and they're like, well, you should change this, this, and this. And you're like, no,
Yeah,
but it's
but
finished.
at least you read it. I happen to agree. Every writer is different, but I always say it's like showing pictures of your baby like in utero, like the you know
Yes.
the ultrasound photos. It's just like black and white
Yeah.
blobs, and people are like, "Oh, she's beautiful," you know. You can't really.
Right. And it's beautiful to you, right? It means something to you, but it's not ready to mean something necessarily to everyone else. Yeah, completely.
No disrespect to people who like to share. There's a million ways to. There's no right or wrong way to do it, but I happen to be in the group in the same boat as you. I like to keep it close. You know, speaking of keeping things close to the chest, can we ask you about what you're writing now, or would you rather not talk about that?
Sure, I'll say very generally, you know, just to keep things difficult for myself, I'll do another totally different genre. So this book is contemporary. It has a scientist as the main character and it has some murder mystery elements. I'll say that. Um, so yeah, it's something different. I'm like, I have doing a different genre every time. I'm gonna run out of genres eventually. But there is something, having done the novel in the future and the historical novel, there is something delightfully quick about having your character like eat something for breakfast or put on some clothing and not having to like research that or think thoroughly about, you know, okay, eggs. I know there's eggs, you know, in the year 2023. I don't have to think about it.
Yeah, I don't think
We'll
people
see.
realize like every step, every sentence has to be sort of historically checked and researched when
Right,
you're writing.
exactly.
Yeah.
So that has
I
been, yeah.
I admire how many different genres do you read that widely as well? Are you a wide, do you read murder mysteries and dystopian and
Yeah,
historical? Yeah.
I do. I do. I'm a big fan of Agatha Christie, actually. I've been going back and reading her books again. So yeah, I do read widely. I think it actually, you know, it's hard when you're kind of trying to build traction in a literary career to keep jumping around. So I think it would actually be easier if I took one genre and stuck to it, but you just have to do what feels right. So
Yeah. Well, I'm just gonna check the questions. Oh my goodness. There's so many. Mari Tekdemir asks, Dear Ariel, you've highlighted the importance of history by also repeating the question, what are we going to do with history? You think the characters in the end couldn't answer it, but what's your experience as an author? After writing a historical novel, do you think you discovered your own personal history better through fiction? What's your experience before and after writing this
Mhm.
particular narrative? Did you feel closer to your personal history?
Mhm. Mhm. Um,
Or did you
I think I
discover something
do.
you didn't know about it, you know?
I mean, so much of it I didn't know. I mean, so much of what I do think it is important, as much as we can, and it's impossible to be completely thorough when we look at the past. But I do think absorbing as much as we can about different ways of life, about what happened, about understanding how we got to where we are today is immensely important. Um, and I will say, I think I do want to write about my Armenian side of the family as well. I have something a little bit in the works, but probably not for the next book, probably the book after. Um, I do think my own childhood for both my mother's and father's side of the family, I always had sort of like a large scope idea, time frame in my mind. Like I'd never just I was always very much aware of like where my parents had come from, where my grandparents had come from, and where my great grandparents had come from, and where my great great grandparents had come from. That was always sort of, uh, it was always at my back in a way. Like I always knew what was right behind me. Um, and I think getting that down on the page is an incredibly fulfilling process for me. And I hope it just, we can get so caught up in what's right in front of us. We can get so caught up in our daily life. And it's hard. I mean, I think that's the kind of beauty of novels, that it can completely transport you and remind you how big the world is, not just how big the world is right now, but how big the world is in terms of like what has happened. So much has happened, so much has combined forces to create what we have right now. And again, it's impossible to be thorough because history is so vast. But I do think novels can pluck out from the past stories that kind of can act as a metaphor. So I can't tell the whole story of the Klondike Gold Rush, but I can tell what I think is a story that will stand in for a lot of what happened at that time and really pull some of the most salient issues from that time. And in some ways, I think that is the difference between like a historical novel and just history, is that you want the novel to act as a kind of metaphor for multiple histories.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Speaking of multiple histories, when you wrote, when you look at the two novels that you wrote, I think there's a question here that articulates my question as well, which is, did you see a common theme between the two, or are there I think writers have, obsessions, different obsessions, and we know what they are by book two. Sometimes we know what they are by book one. Do you see any threads that are, common between the Office of Mercy and the Prospectors? They're very different books. We've already mentioned very different genres, but written by, your fascinating brain. Do you see things that are running through both of those narratives that are common? That's a hard
I think
question.
no, I do. It is hard, but yeah, because on the surface they are so different. They sound different, they look different, they're in different genres. But I do think there are. I always am fascinated by kind of the same moral questions again and again, which is how much do we give to the people who are closest to us? How much do we owe people who are in some way very different from us? So in the Office of Mercy, there is kind of an in-group, again, this is like sci-fi, so we're in another realm entirely in terms of writing. It's a sci-fi novel, but there's people living in literal domes in a future society, post-apocalyptic. And how much do we preserve our own lives and take care of the people very near us, but then there are people outside those domes, and so the moral question at the heart of that book is, what do we owe people who have nothing to do with us, who are strangers to us, um just on the fact of their being human, no matter how, quote unquote foreign they seem to us. What do we owe them as people? So I think those moral questions are in the Prospectors as well, in terms of like, okay, do we amass resources? Do we amass wealth to better our own circumstances and to give it to our children, our children's children, and their children? Do we amass wealth in that way? As capitalism in the economy and so much in the world tells us, oh yes, you can do that. That's fine. That's okay. Or do we say, like, this is wrong. We need to, spread resources. We need to share. We need to do more for others, even when our first instinct is not to do much for others who are different from us. So I do think there are kind of common themes running throughout. Yeah, for sure.
Fascinating. Well, we can't end without talking about the sourdough story. Can you tell us about that and your trip to this part of the world? Did you actually, do the walk when they're climbing that mountain? That's one of the most riveting, sort of suspenseful scenes in the novel. Did you do that? And is there really a sourdough sucking competition somewhere in Dawson Creek? Inquiring minds want to know.
Yes. Well, I'm a good, it was really important for me to be there and to be sort of like immersed in Dawson City. So I am the type, I was there in the bar. The sourdough is real. You take a shot and there's this like dehydrated toe at the base of the shot glass that someone lost to frostbite. So, I mean, that writes itself. It was right there for the taking. But, the writer that I am, I'm very happy to sit on the sidelines of the bar and watch someone else do it. I did not do that myself. So it was a great trip. I mean, I was able to go out to the gold fields. I was able to see so much of what is in the novel in those contemporary sections, and just pull what details I could. Yes. So it's still running, the sourdough cocktail, for anyone who finds themselves in Dawson City.
That was hilarious part of the book. I want to thank everyone for being here. And I want to thank you, Ariel, for writing this incredible book. If you haven't purchased the Prospectors, please go to the Yalla website or the Nasser website. You can find that anywhere books are sold as well. Thank you for everyone who joined us today. I'm going to give it over to the organizers to perhaps conclude with a little bit of some information.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Aline. And thank you for everyone. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. There's so many great questions, but thank you so much to everyone who came out today, everyone for organizing.
Thank you both, Ariel and Aline. This has been such a lovely conversation. I am such a fan, Aline, of your work, and now Ariel, to read the Prospectors has been it's been a joy to read. If you haven't read it yet, as Aline said, pick it up today. It's both a riveting story and a fascinating look at the history of the Klondike Gold Rush and how it affected the indigenous communities in the Yukon. Thank you so much to our co-sponsors, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research and the Krikor and Clara Zorab Information Center. And thank you to Hovsep Markaryan, Yalla's new executive director, for producing our Literary Lights series. Our next event in the series will be on Saturday, April 13th. And for the first time, we're featuring 2 children's books. The first is Babo, A Tale of Armenian Rug Washing Day by Ashik Kamalyan, which is a favorite book in my house. And Lost Words, an Armenian story of survival and hope by Leila Bukharim about the Armenian genocide, that's coming out soon. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Help us organize more events like this by filling out a short survey in the chat. And please continue to read along with us as we celebrate bright lights from contemporary Armenian authors. Thank you all again and have a lovely weekend.